I pulled into my driveway in Phoenix after 11 days away, my body aching from the long drive back from San Diego. My older sister Barbara had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 weeks ago, and I'd rushed to be with her through the first round of chemotherapy. She was stable now, fighting hard, but I needed to get home to Eleanor, my wife. She has early-stage Parkinson's disease, and while she's still mostly independent, I don't like leaving her alone for too long. Our son Brandon had promised to stay with her while I was gone. "Don't worry about Mom, Dad," he'd said when he dropped me off at the airport. "Melissa and I will take good care of her. You just focus on Aunt Barbara." The house looked wrong. That was my first thought as I stepped out of my truck. The blinds were all closed, which Eleanor never does. She loves natural light, always has. And there was a strange smell coming from somewhere, something sour that I couldn't quite place. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked to the front door, fishing for my keys. That's when I heard it, a tapping sound, weak but rhythmic, coming from the side of the house, from the direction of the converted garage. My heart started pounding. We'd turned that garage into a storage room years ago when we stopped using it for cars. There was no reason for anyone to be in there. I dropped my bag and walked around the side of the house, the tapping growing louder as I approached. When I reached the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A brand new deadbolt lock, installed from the outside. A lock I had never purchased, never installed, never seen before. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone in there?" The tapping stopped. Then I heard a voice, weak and hoarse, barely recognizable. "Richard? Richard, is that you? Please, please help me." It was Eleanor. I ran to my truck and grabbed the tire iron from the back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I wedged it into the doorframe and pried with everything I had. The wood splintered. The lock held for a moment, then the whole mechanism ripped free. I yanked the door open and the smell hit me like a wall. Urine, sweat, something rotten. Eleanor was sitting on an old lawn chair in the corner, wrapped in a dirty blanket. Her hair was matted. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked and bleeding. There was a bucket next to her that I couldn't look at. A case of water bottles, mostly empty, was scattered on the floor beside some granola bar wrappers. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed to take a moment to focus, to recognize. "Richard." She started crying, her whole body shaking. "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't leave me here." I was across that room in 2 steps, pulling her into my arms. She weighed nothing. She felt like a bird, fragile and trembling. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. I've got you now." "They said you weren't coming back," she whispered. "They said you'd decided to stay in California, that you didn't want me anymore." "Who said that? Eleanor, who did this to you?" She looked at me with those confused, terrified eyes. Brandon, and Melissa. They said it was just for a little while. They said I needed to stay quiet. But then they stopped coming. The water ran out 2 days ago. I thought I was going to die in here, Richard. I thought I was going to die alone. I carried her inside the house and laid her on the couch. Then I called 911. While I waited for the ambulance, I held her hand and looked around our home. Things were missing. The antique clock that had belonged to my mother. The paintings we'd collected over 30 years of marriage. Eleanor's jewelry box was gone from the bedroom. And on the kitchen counter, I found a stack of papers that made my blood run cold. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. They started an IV immediately. "Severe dehydration," they said. "Malnutrition. Signs of muscle wasting." When they asked how long she'd been confined, I did the math. I'd been gone for 11 days. Based on the empty water bottles and granola bar wrappers, they'd left her with maybe 5 days' worth of supplies. She'd been without water for at least 48 hours, maybe longer. "Another day or two," one of the paramedics said quietly. "And we'd be having a very different conversation right now, sir." I rode with Eleanor to Banner University Medical Center. She kept drifting in and out of consciousness, squeezing my hand whenever she was lucid. At the hospital, they admitted her immediately. A social worker appeared within the hour, followed by a detective from the Phoenix Police Department's Vulnerable Adult Crimes Unit. His name was Detective Ruiz, and he had kind eyes but a voice that suggested he'd seen things that would keep most people up at night. "Mr. Patterson, I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning." So I did. "My name is Richard Patterson. I'm 68 years old, retired after 35 years teaching high school history in the Scottsdale Unified School District. My wife, Eleanor, is 66. She was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 3 years ago. It's still early stage. She has some tremors, some balance issues, occasional confusion when she's tired or stressed, but she's still sharp, still herself. She still beats me at Scrabble every single time. Our son, Brandon, is 42. He works as a real estate agent here in Phoenix, or at least he did. I'm not sure anymore what's true about him. He married Melissa 6 years ago. She works in marketing, or that's what she told us. They never had children, which Eleanor and I always thought was a shame. But we didn't push. Everyone makes their own choices. I thought Brandon was a good son. He called every Sunday. He came over for holidays. When Eleanor was diagnosed, he seemed genuinely concerned, genuinely supportive. "Whatever you guys need," he'd said, "I'm here for you." When Barbara got sick, Brandon was the obvious choice to help with Eleanor. He knew her routines. He knew her medications. He and Melissa had stayed with her once before when I went to my high school reunion in Ohio 2 years ago. Everything had been fine then. There was no reason to think this time would be different. For the first 5 days, Brandon sent me texts every morning and evening. "Mom's doing great. We watched her favorite movie last night. Don't worry about anything." I called Eleanor's cell phone a few times, but it kept going to voicemail. Brandon said she'd misplaced it somewhere in the house, that they were looking for it. I didn't think much of it. Eleanor misplaces things sometimes. It's part of the Parkinson's. But then the text got shorter. "All good. Mom's fine." And then, on day 7, they stopped altogether. I called Brandon's phone, voicemail. I called Melissa, voicemail. I called Eleanor's phone again and again, nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. Barbara needed me. The chemo was brutal. I couldn't just leave her alone in that hospital, and surely, my own son wouldn't let anything happen to his mother. I was wrong. Detective Ruiz listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked me about the papers I'd found on the kitchen counter. Those papers. I can barely talk about them without feeling sick. The first document was a durable power of attorney, dated 4 days after I left for San Diego. It gave Brandon complete control over Eleanor's finances, her medical decisions, everything. Eleanor's signature was at the bottom, shaky but recognizable. I know my wife's handwriting. It was hers. But I also know my wife. She would never have signed something like that without discussing it with me first. The second document was a withdrawal slip from our joint savings account. $320,000 transferred to an account I'd never heard of. That was our retirement money. That was everything we'd saved over 40 years of working, scripting, planning for our future. The third document was a deed transfer for our house, our home, the place we'd lived for 23 years, where we'd raised Brandon, where we'd planned to spend the rest of our lives together. It had been transferred into Brandon's name, along with a new home equity line of credit for $250,000. The fourth document was a brokerage statement showing that Eleanor's investment portfolio, worth another $180,000, had been liquidated and transferred to the same unknown account. In total, they had taken $750,000 from us, every penny we had. Detective Ruiz's expression didn't change as I showed him the papers, but I saw his jaw tighten. "Mr. Patterson, I'm going to be honest with you. This is one of the most egregious cases of elder financial exploitation I've seen in my 12 years on this job. Combined with the unlawful imprisonment of your wife, we're looking at very serious felony charges." "What about attempted murder?" I asked. "They left her to die. If I hadn't come home early, she would have died." Ruiz hesitated. "That's going to be harder to prove. For attempted murder, we'd need to show specific intent to kill. Their defense will argue they intended to come back, that they left supplies, that they didn't mean for her to die. The imprisonment charge alone carries up to 12 years in Arizona. The financial exploitation charges stack on top of that. Trust me, Mr. Patterson, they're going to pay for what they did. It wasn't enough, but it was something." The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and legal consultations. Eleanor was in the hospital for 5 days. The doctors treated her for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a urinary tract infection that had gone untreated for days. They also noted signs of psychological trauma. She had nightmares every night, waking up screaming that the door was locked, that no one was coming. While Eleanor recovered, I went back to the house with Detective Ruiz and a forensic team. What we found in that converted garage made me want to burn the place down. They had planned this carefully. The deadbolt lock had been purchased 3 weeks before I left for San Diego. They'd bought the supplies, the water bottles, the granola bars, all with cash, so there'd be no credit card trail. They'd removed the light bulbs from the fixtures. They'd taken Eleanor's phone and hidden it somewhere I still haven't found. They'd told the neighbors that Eleanor had gone to stay with relatives while I was away, so no one would come checking on her. And on Brandon's laptop, which he'd left behind in his hurry to leave, we found everything. Emails between Brandon and Melissa going back 8 months, discussing their retirement plan. Messages about researching countries without extradition treaties with the United States. Bookmarks for real estate listings in Costa Rica and Panama. A detailed timeline of how they would execute the scheme, how they would get Eleanor to sign the documents, how they would keep her quiet until they could leave the country. There was one email thread that I will never forget as long as I live. It was from 3 days before I left for San Diego. Brandon to Melissa, "Mom's getting suspicious." She asked why I was asking about their account numbers. "We need to move faster." Melissa to Brandon, "Just tell her it's for estate planning. She trusts you." Brandon to Melissa, "I know. That's what makes this work. She actually thinks I care about her." I read that line over and over. She actually thinks I care about her. My son, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle, who I took fishing every summer, who I put through college, who I walked down the aisle at his wedding. He'd written those words about his own mother. Detective Ruiz traced the money. Most of it had already been wired to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The house transfer had been flagged by the title company as potentially fraudulent, but not before Brandon had drawn the full $250,000 from the equity line. The brokerage account was completely empty. But here's where they made their mistake. They got greedy, and they got sloppy. Brandon had used his real estate connections to find a buyer for one of our properties, a small rental house in Tempe that we'd owned for 15 years. He'd forged Eleanor's signature on the sale documents and pocketed the proceeds. But the buyer had gotten cold feet and called the title company to verify the sale. When the title company couldn't reach Eleanor directly, they contacted me through an old phone number on file. That call came while I was still in San Diego. I called Brandon immediately, demanding to know what was going on. He told me it was a misunderstanding, that he could explain everything, but I could hear something in his voice. Something I'd never heard before. Fear. Calculation. The voice of a stranger. That's why I came home early. Not because Barbara was doing better, though she was, but because something in my gut told me that something was very, very wrong. If I had waited one more day, Eleanor would be dead. The manhunt lasted 48 hours. Brandon and Melissa had left Phoenix the same day I found Eleanor, driving south toward the Mexican border. But their pictures were already on every news channel in Arizona, and a state trooper spotted their car at a gas station in Nogales, just 15 miles from the border crossing. They were arrested without incident. Brandon didn't resist. Melissa tried to run and got about 20 feet before the trooper caught her. They were transported back to Phoenix and booked into the Maricopa County Jail. The charges came down the next week. Brandon faced 12 counts. Elder abuse, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, unlawful imprisonment, forgery, fraud, theft, and half a dozen related charges. Melissa faced 10 counts as a co-conspirator. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office assigned a senior prosecutor named Catherine Webb, a woman with a reputation for being relentless in elder abuse cases. "Mr. Patterson," she told me at our first meeting, "I want you to understand something. These are not minor charges. Your son is facing a potential sentence of 30 to 40 years if convicted on all counts. Your daughter-in-law is looking at 20 to 30. This is the kind of case that doesn't get plea bargained down to nothing. We're going to trial, and we're going to win." I asked her the same question I'd asked Detective Ruiz. What about attempted murder? Catherine Webb leaned back in her chair and sighed. I know you want that charge. I understand why. But here's the reality. Arizona law requires us to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they specifically intended to kill Eleanor. Their defense will argue that leaving her with water and food, even inadequate amounts, shows they didn't intend for her to die. They'll say they planned to come back, that they just lost track of time, that it was neglect, not attempted murder. A jury might buy that, and if they acquit on the attempted murder charge, it could undermine our credibility on the other charges. The safest path to the longest sentence is to prosecute what we can absolutely prove. I didn't like it, but I understood it. The law is not about justice in the way most people imagine. It's about what you can prove. The trial happened 8 months later. Eleanor was too fragile to testify in person, but we recorded her deposition in advance. Watching her on that screen, confused and trembling, trying to explain how her own son had locked her in a dark room and left her to die, was the hardest thing I've ever experienced. Harder than Barbara's diagnosis. Harder than the moment I found Eleanor in that garage, because I had to sit there and watch, helpless, as she relived every moment of that nightmare. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They presented the financial records, the forged documents, the timeline of the fraud. They called expert witnesses who explained how Eleanor's Parkinson's made her more susceptible to manipulation. They showed the jury photographs of the garage, the bucket, the empty water bottles, the scratches on the inside of the door where Eleanor had tried to claw her way out. Brandon's defense lawyer tried everything. He claimed Brandon had been manipulated by Melissa. He claimed Eleanor had consented to the financial transactions. He claimed the garage confinement was a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. The jury didn't buy any of it. Guilty on all counts. Both of them. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. I submitted a victim impact statement that took me 3 days to write. I talked about Eleanor's nightmares, her fear of small spaces now, how she sometimes wakes up crying for help in the middle of the night. I talked about the financial devastation, how we'd lost everything we'd saved for our retirement, how we might have to sell our home to pay for Eleanor's ongoing care. I talked about the betrayal, how I would never understand how the son I raised could do something so monstrous to his own mother. Eleanor couldn't write a statement. Her Parkinson's had progressed noticeably since the trauma. Stress accelerates the disease, her neurologist told me. The ordeal in that garage had stolen years from her life. Judge Martinez read through everything. Then she looked at Brandon, sitting in his orange jumpsuit at the defense table. Mr. Patterson, she said, in my 22 years on the bench, I have seen many terrible things. I have seen violence, cruelty, and greed in forms that would shock most people. But I have rarely seen anything as calculated, as cold-blooded, and as utterly without conscience as what you did to your own mother. You exploited her medical condition to steal her life savings. You imprisoned her in a dark room with inadequate food and water. You left her to suffer, alone and terrified, while you made plans to flee the country with her money. And you did all of this to a woman who loved you, who trusted you, who gave you life itself. She paused, and I saw something in her eyes that looked almost like disgust. Brandon Patterson, you are hereby sentenced to 32 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. You will not be eligible for parole until you have served at least 20 years. Brandon's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. Melissa Patterson, you are hereby sentenced to 24 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. You will not be eligible for parole until you have served at least 16 years. I watched my son's face as the sentence was read. I expected tears. I expected remorse. I expected something human. Instead, I saw anger. He looked at me across that courtroom with pure hatred in his eyes, as if I had done something wrong by refusing to let him destroy us. I didn't look away. I held his gaze until the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom in chains. That was 3 months ago. The money is gone. Most of it, anyway. The offshore accounts are beyond our reach. The criminal restitution order says Brandon and Melissa owe us $750,000 plus interest, but you can't get blood from a stone. The civil lawsuit I filed will attach to any future assets they might have, any inheritance, any wages they might earn after they're released in 20 or 30 years. But realistically, we'll never see that money again. We had to sell the rental property in Tempe to pay legal fees and medical bills. We've refinanced the house twice to make ends meet. At 68 years old, I'm looking at going back to work, maybe teaching part-time at a community college, just to keep us afloat. Eleanor doesn't ask about Brandon anymore. At first, she asked every day, "Where's Brandon? Why doesn't he visit? Did I do something to upset him?" I tried explaining, once, what he had done. She listened, nodded, seemed to understand. The next morning, she asked where Brandon was again. Her Parkinson's has progressed to the point where short-term memory is becoming unreliable. So now I just tell her that Brandon moved away for work. It's easier than explaining the truth over and over. Barbara finished her chemotherapy last month. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. She calls me every week now, checking on Eleanor, checking on me. She's the only family I have left that I can trust. People ask me sometimes if I regret pursuing the charges so aggressively, if maybe I should have tried to work things out as a family, if 32 years is too harsh for my own son. Here's what I tell them. My son locked his mother in a garage for 11 days. He stole every dollar we had saved over 40 years of hard work. He planned to let her die and flee to Costa Rica with the money. He wrote an email saying she actually thinks I care about her, about the woman who gave birth to him, raised him, loved him unconditionally for 42 years. 32 years is not too harsh. It's the minimum acceptable consequence for what he did. There's a concept in law called duty of care. When you agree to take responsibility for someone, especially someone who is vulnerable, you have a legal and moral obligation to protect them. Brandon didn't just fail in that duty. He weaponized it. He used our trust, Eleanor's trust, as a tool to destroy us. That's not a mistake. That's not a lapse in judgment. That's evil. I don't use that word lightly. I taught history for 35 years. I've studied the worst things human beings have done to each other. I know what real evil looks like. And what my son did to his mother, to the woman who held him when he was sick, who cheered at his graduation, who cried with joy at his wedding, that was evil. Some people tell me I should forgive him, that holding on to anger will only hurt me, that Brandon is still my son, still my flesh and blood, still the little boy who used to fall asleep in my arms. They're wrong. Brandon stopped being my son the moment he locked that door and walked away. The man in that prison cell is a stranger who shares my DNA. Nothing more. Eleanor still has good days and bad days. On good days, she laughs at my terrible jokes and beats me at Scrabble and remembers our 43rd anniversary. On bad days, she doesn't recognize our house, doesn't remember that we have a son, sometimes doesn't remember who I am. Last week was a bad day. She looked at me across the breakfast table and asked, very politely, who I was and what I was doing in her kitchen. It lasted about 2 hours before she came back to herself, confused and apologetic. I held her hand and told her it was okay, that I would always be here, no matter what. That's the thing Brandon never understood. Love isn't about what you can get from someone. It's about what you're willing to give. It's about staying when things get hard. It's about holding someone's hand when they don't even know who you are. Brandon wanted money. He was willing to let his mother die to get it. I wanted Eleanor. I would have given everything I had to save her. That's the difference between us. And it's a difference that can never be bridged. I still drive by the prison sometimes. Lewis Prison Complex, out in Buckeye. I don't know why I do it. Maybe I'm hoping to feel something. Some connection to the son I used to have. Some ghost of the relationship we used to share. But I never do. All I feel is empty. Brandon will be 88 years old when he's eligible for parole, assuming he lives that long. Melissa will be 74. They'll be old and broken and alone, just like they planned to make us. There's a certain justice in that, I suppose. But it's not the justice I wanted. The justice I wanted was impossible. I wanted my son back. I wanted to understand why. I wanted to rewind time and see the moment when he stopped being the boy I loved and became the monster who hurt us. I wanted to fix whatever broke inside him. I'll never have any of those things. What I have instead is Eleanor. diminished, fragile, slipping away from me a little more each day, but still here, still mine. Still, the woman I fell in love with 45 years ago when she smiled at me in the library at Arizona State University. They tried to take her from me. They almost succeeded, but I came home early. And she's still here, and that has to be enough. If you're watching this, if you have elderly parents or a spouse with a medical condition, please hear me. Trust, but verify. Don't assume that family will do the right thing just because they're family. Check in unexpectedly. Ask questions. Pay attention to the warning signs, because the people who hurt you worst are always the ones you never suspected. I never suspected my son, and that blindness almost cost me everything. Don't make the same mistake. As for me and Eleanor, we're still here, still fighting, still together. The house is quiet now. There are no visits from Brandon and Melissa, no Sunday dinners, no grandchildren that will never exist. But there's peace, there's love, there's Eleanor's hand in mine as we watch the sunset over the Sonoran Desert from our back porch. Brandon thought he could take that from us. He was wrong, and in the end, that's the only victory that matters.